Good day, everybody. Great to speak to academics, investors, regulators, and all people who want to tackle the climate crisis. In my daily work, I speak to a different audience, a less receptive audience, the boards of oil and gas companies. Sometimes, as you can see here, during the shareholder meetings, but also sometimes I'm invited for a coffee with a CEO to discuss climate and climate action. And to be honest, I'm always exhausted after that kind of meetings, because the CEO would kindly ask me to withdraw our shareholder resolution, of which I will tell you later more. And I try to convince him, even inspire him, how great it would be if his company, Shell, BP, Total Energies, for example, would speed up the energy transition. And we always part by saying that we agree to disagree about the speed of the energy transition, but I'm always exhausted. So thanks for being here. Jan, Peter, thank you for inviting me. Jan and Peter asked me to tell you about the journey of Follow This, to show you how shareholders can have influence and create accountability among themselves and among oil majors. The mission of Follow This, the organization I founded in 2015, a shareholder organization, is to compel big oil companies to put their brains and billions behind the energy transition. And we're Dutch, so we had to start somewhere. So I started with close to home with Royal Dutch Shell. In 2015, when I told people about this mission, I often got a very friendly smile and an even friendlier remark saying, "Okay, Mark, so you want to change the course of Shell? That's a very noble cause, meaning dream on. We as ordinary citizens have no influence at all on an oil major, especially not on such multinational companies. I hope to convince you in the next 10 minutes that as ordinary citizens, we can indeed have influence on oil majors. And I will do this by telling you about how we approach this with Shell. Back in 2015, I was still a journalist. I'm an engineer who turned journalist to write about the climate crisis and to write about solutions. And as an engineer, I could see that renewables are there, getting more and more cheap, and fossil fuels are getting more expensive. So I thought, okay, there's a huge problem, but there's also a solution. So if I write enough about it and explain the companies how great it would be if they would join the energy transition, that they could help, we could solve the energy crisis. And sometimes I concluded that story with Shell, if you don't change course, you will be the Kodak of the 21st century. Unfortunately, that didn't work. I didn't become an influential journalist. So I decided I had to do it in another way. And then I concluded that the only entity big oil companies have to listen to are their shareholders. And that's where Follow This is based on. We're based on three convictions, basically. The first one is that big oil can make or break the Paris Climate Agreement. The second one is that listed companies have to listen to their shareholders. And the third conviction is that the only power shareholders have is once a year during the shareholder meeting. And that power is the power of their vote. And that was never used before. I've sometimes asked pension funds, for example, how do you use the fact that you're an owner of an oil major to achieve your goal? You also want to achieve to stop climate change. They said, yeah, we have very good engagement. We have discussions behind the scenes, and we are slowly steering them in the right direction. And if you would ask, what do you discuss? They would say, that's confidential. So I thought I have to break through that deadlock and start igniting the discussion about voting again. So as an organization, you can see here that I first went to the shareholder meeting. Then we raised enough capital with our members. We have 10,000 members now to have 5 million together to file a so-called shareholder resolution. And then that's when it gets serious, because then everybody has to show their true colors. So since 2016, we put on the shareholder meetings of Shell and later other oil majors a very simple question. We say, in the shareholder resolutions, shareholders support the company to set targets that are aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement. But the devil is in the detail. We asked for targets, emissions reduction targets for scope 1, 2, and 3. And you can imagine how they responded and how Shell responded in the first years. They said scope 3, the emissions which occur when customers use our products, when customers burn our products, that's not our responsibility. So it's an unreasonable ask. But luckily enough, more and more shareholders started voting for our climate resolutions. The first year 2.7%, the next year 6.3%. Sounds little, but if you compare that to all other resolutions where 99 point whatever percent votes with management in a Chinese or North Korean style, you know that 6% is quite a signal to a board. And Shell picked up that signal. And in 2017, by the end of 2017, after 6% of the shareholders voted for our climate resolutions, they set a scope 3 target. They were the first oil major in the world to promise to cut their emissions by 2050 in half relative. It was not substantial enough yet, but at least they crossed the Rubicon on scope 3. So that's what we achieved with our shareholder resolution. And basically, the same thing happened with the other oil majors where we put the resolution on the ballot. In 2019, we put a resolution on the ballot of BP and Equinor. The response was exactly the same. Scope 3, not our problem. The CEO of BP literally responded to me on the shareholders meeting when I asked him, do you really think scope 3 is not your problem? He said, no, it's not my problem. It's my customer's problem. 8% voted for the resolution, and next year BP set a scope 3 target. Equinor did the same, and in the US, we also got 2 oil majors to set scope 3 targets. So by just simply putting it on the ballot and asking investors to vote for it, when an increasing number of investors vote for a resolution like that, these companies set targets and improve targets. Every time we put the resolution on the ballot again, Shell improved their targets. First, they promised just to cut their emissions in half by 2050. And now they're already promising to be net zero by 2050 and cut their emissions by 20% in 2030. So every time the votes go up, the ambitions of the oil majors go up. Looking at this slide, you might now think, oh, what an arrogant story. This guy is telling us that he single-handedly changed the strategy of 5 oil majors so far. And I can even add that also Total Energies, they had a scope 3 target following Shell, but they also set a net zero 2050 target after we filed our resolution. So basically 6 oil majors we had influence on. And I can assure you that if it wasn't for Follow This, these companies wouldn't have scope 3 targets. But it's not thanks to us. We just put it on the agenda. The real heroes of the story are the investors who voted for our climate resolutions. And here I show how the Dutch investors voted. As you can see, in the first year, just 1 investor was brave enough to vote against the board of Shell and in favor of our climate resolution. That was Actiam. And next year's other investors followed one by one. And I can tell you how many billions are behind this, but I could better tell you which people are behind it, because it's just individuals who take this kind of decisions. And I can easily name them, but they rather be not named because they want to do their good work behind the scenes. But these are what I call the climate advocates, the climate heroes within the institutional investor community who think, okay, now I have a job where I can have influence. I'm going to use that influence. And no matter how much pressure there is from Shell or BP, I will use my vote. And with this voting, they're really driving change. And these people are very morally driven, but I'm absolutely sure that they are morally driven, but they use financial arguments. And that's how we win this fight, the fight against the climate crisis and the fight to change big oil. Institutional investors who have hundreds of billions, sometimes thousands of billions to take care of for pensioners, for people who save money, fully realize that all this money is in danger because of the climate crisis. If the climate crisis gets out of hand, we will have floods, extreme weather, heat waves, bushfires, you name it, which will have a devastating effect on the world economy. And they see themselves as stewards of the world economy, and therefore they start voting for this climate resolutions. So that's how they use their influence. I can show you that we're not there yet. If you look at this scheme, which we call the Satie framework, you will see that one by one, oil majors are starting to set Scope 3 ambitions, as I call them, because they're too non-committal and not good enough to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement. And we have to do a lot more. We have to get really emission reduction targets, and then we have the investments have to go the right direction, and then the emissions will go down. And if you look at Shell, you will see that they're far from Paris aligned. Science tells us that in order to stay between 1.5 degrees C, emissions have to almost halve by 2030. Shell still thinks they can increase emissions by 2030, and all oil majors want to increase emissions by 2030. This slide is even outdated. Shell wants to increase emissions, and that's because after years and years that the votes went up and the ambitions went up, after the Ukraine war, as you can see, in 2022, the empire strikes back, as I sometimes call it. So after years of exponential growth and increasing ambitions from the oil majors, the high oil prices, the energy crisis, let a lot of institutional investors believe that they should choose for short-term profits instead of long-term climate risk. And they really thought this was a dilemma. It's a false dilemma, of course. You can easily decouple short-term profits from long-term risks. So let me conclude with this. With this climate resolutions, we have created a lot of clarity. Clarity that big oil companies don't want to commit to the Paris Climate Agreement. Shell's rejection of our climate resolutions, their advice to shareholders to vote against Paris alignment, was a crucial evidence in the landmark court case against Shell, won by Friends of the Earth, because they could tell the judge, Shell can tell you whatever they like, but there's one shareholder asking every year to commit to Paris, and they say no. So that clarity we created, and we also created a lot of clarity and accountability in the investor community. You can now easily see which investors vote for Paris alignment, which is basically our resolution, or vote against it. So we create a lot of clarity here. Let me conclude. To avoid climate disaster, to stay within 1.5 degrees C, the world has to almost halve emissions by 2030. None of these oil majors has plans to do so. As long as their shareholders allow them, they will increase emissions. They will even largely ignore court cases. They will, like Shell does, they will lobby against climate legislation. They will not offer renewables at scale. They will just hang on to fossil fuels as long as possible. So shareholders are crucial. Without shareholder pressure, with all the other pressure we need, the Paris Climate Agreement will not be achieved. So that's why we will continue to empower shareholders to use their rights, all their rights, including voting, until big oil makes or breaks the Paris Climate Agreement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. I hope it's all right if Peter and I ask a few questions to you about the work. And one thing that is really interesting in your presentation is on targets and how you use these targets to discuss with the fossil industry how they are using and reducing their emissions. My first question would be, how do you develop these targets? I mean, of course, your reference point is the Paris Agreement, but how do you? I can see that there's some considerations that you make in what type of target that you want to set for each firm to which that you approach. So how do you develop these targets?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, Jan. As shareholders, we have to try to keep as agnostic as possible. Our first resolution, we asked for a shift in investment, which we still think needs to be done. But then the investors said, we're not going to sit in the board seat. We don't want to be prescriptive as investors. The strategy is up to the board. So therefore, we just asked for targets in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. And it's up to the companies to fill that in. And the issue is nobody knows exactly what a target in line with Paris for an oil major should be. We all know the world has to cut emissions by 45%. So you can argue that a company in the global north should do a lot more than 45%. You could also argue that oil and gas should do a bit less because coal has to go faster. But we could all agree that it should be large-scale emission reductions, 20, 30, 40 or 50%. And since the oil majors are so far from that, most of them still want to increase emissions. That's a discussion which will come later. So for now, it's just asking them for large-scale emission reductions, and they can prove themselves what they think is Paris aligned.
That's an interesting last sentence that you actually just said. One thing that I would find interesting then is so the firms can promise that they will reduce the emission on the one hand. On the other hand, you want to make sure that if they promise that not only that they keep to their promise, but actually that you are able to verify that they kept to their promise. So is there anything that you do to actually make sure that, okay, they promise that they reduce their emission, but that it is actually assured that if they say so and they report on that report is correct. So what do you do to actually establish that?
Of course, as soon as they have really set targets, which none of them has done yet, then we have to monitor it, and then we have to see that it results in real-world emission reductions. That's what we need. And then we need accountability, and I think accountants could do a great job. I think the financials they can fully automate or leave to artificial intelligence, and now they have to think of smart things to monitor CO2.
No, that's great. I'm not sure about the remark on the financials, Mark, but I'm pretty sure that it's important. It's important that we actually establish that indeed that the promised emission reductions are actually measured correctly.
Yeah. No, the remark about artificial intelligence was irony, but I now realize we have an American audience, so and some Americans don't see irony. I think I'm afraid. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, that's good, Peter. Please.
So you talk a lot about the shareholder involvement and shareholders being active and shareholders being behind the movement. These are primarily institutional shareholders, I assume. I'm really asking, to what extent does sort of the retail investor, the shareholder that does not have a lot of influence, to what extent can they or are they informed about what is actually happening at the big oil companies?
I think the retail shareholders, if they read newspapers, they will be informed. They are informed. And we also have a lot of retail members. So our organization is based on 10,000 retail shareholders. And these are people who either have bought a share in Shell to support our movement or already have this share in Shell, BP or Exxon in their portfolio for years or even generations. And they also agree that if these companies don't change, their shares will be worthless and climate change will get out of hand. So retail shareholders also play a good role. But also the retail shareholders, like the institutional investors, we have to explain them that they have to decouple short-term profits from long-term risks. And that's the most challenging job we have. We don't have the PR prowess and capabilities of big oil, and they're very good in placing false dilemmas in the public domain. And I think a lot of people think that they have to choose between short-term profits and climate, and that's a false dilemma. You can easily take the short-term profits from oil and gas in the next years and invest part of that in the business models of the future to make sure you still have a viable business in the 30s and the 40s of this century. But that's a very difficult thing to
But
explain.
isn't that a real dilemma too? Because if I can make a profit today, right, and tomorrow, or I promise a much higher profit, 3 years from now, right? Many shareholders will say, "Well, I want it now," and there's actually psychological research that would actually support this. The work by First King Kahneman would actually support this idea.
Yeah.
So how do you go about convincing them then that they should to select for into the let's say 3-4 years from now?
Yeah, by explaining that investments in the energy system will not come to fruition in 10 or in the first 10 years. Maybe if you're very fast in 7 years. So drilling for new oil and gas will not deliver any profits in the next 5 to 10 years. So investing differently has no influence at all on short-term profits. So yeah, really try to explain that it's a false dilemma, that it's not like you have to choose between profits now and profits in the future. No, you can take the profits today and still ensure that there are profits in the future. And you can only do so if these companies change. It will not take long before they have to pay for damages of climate change. Then their handsome business model is completely gone. The only reason they can make high profits is because, let's face it, they have a very unhealthy business model where a lot of costs are externalized, and they will be internalized by policymakers. And the most important thing is, of course, climate damages. They will have to pay for it, and then their business model is gone.
I think that Peter had a comment on.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think that's a good phrase to end the conversation. We could keep going forever. Let me say thanks very much for a very interesting presentation, and it's a great start to the conference.
Thank you very much, Mark.